Welcome to the Midnight Historian. Tonight we're going to travel quietly through the lives of a few forgotten thinkers, people you may not know, but whose quiet minds helped shape the world in lasting ways. If you enjoy calm stories like this, feel free to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always nice to know who's out there with us. Now get comfortable, breathe deeply, and let's begin. Our first story takes us to a prison cell, where a man named Boethius found peace through philosophy, even as he waited to die. It's the year 524 AD. The Western Roman Empire has fallen. Italy is now ruled by the Ostrogoths, a Germanic people trying to hold onto Roman traditions. In a cold stone prison somewhere in northern Italy, a man sits alone. His name is Boethius. He's about 44 years old. His clothes are simple, his beard grown, and he's writing slowly by the light of an oil lamp. He used to be one of the most respected men in Rome, a philosopher, a mathematician, a translator of ancient Greek wisdom into Latin. He was once rich, honoured, and trusted by kings. But now he's a prisoner, accused of treason, sentenced to die. The silence of his cell is heavy, but inside his mind something is still alive. Boethius was born in 480 AD, just a few years after the last Roman emperor was removed from power. His family was noble and deeply Roman, proud of its culture, its education, its history. He was orphaned young, but adopted by a powerful man named Symmachus, who made sure Boethius received the best education possible. He quickly became known as a scholar. He spoke both Latin and Greek. He loved the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and he believed the old wisdom still had something to offer the crumbling world around him. His dream was to bring Greek philosophy to the Latin-speaking world, to translate it, preserve it, and make it useful. In time, he married Symmachus's daughter, had 2 sons, and entered public life. He rose quickly. By 30, he was a senator. Soon after, he became consul, the highest office still left in Rome under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. Boethius believed in justice. He believed rulers should be wise and fair. He spoke out against corruption. He protected the poor and defended people accused unfairly, and in the end, that's what destroyed him. One day, Boethius defended a senator, accused of plotting against the king. In doing so, he made himself a target. His enemies accused him of treason too. Theodoric, growing paranoid, believed them. Boethius was arrested without a trial, taken far from home, locked in a cold, dark room, and told he would be executed. He had no way to defend himself. He had lost everything. But Boethius was a philosopher, and in the darkness he turned to the one thing he had left, his mind. In his prison cell he began writing, not a letter, not a defence, but a quiet conversation between himself and someone he imagined. A woman, wise, calm and steady. He called her philosophy. She wasn't real in a physical sense, but in Boethius's imagination she was as present as the stone walls around him. Dressed in flowing robes, holding a book and a sceptre, ancient, peaceful, her eyes clear and sharp. She asked, "Why are you crying?" He said, "Because I've lost everything. My status, my freedom, my good name. I tried to live a good life. I tried to be honest and just. And look where it got me." Philosophy listened quietly. Then she said something simple and powerful. "You haven't lost everything. What matters most is still inside you." She reminded him of what he once believed, that true happiness can't be found in fortune, power, or reputation. Those things come and go, like the wind, like a wheel that keeps turning. Sometimes it lifts you up, sometimes it throws you down, but it never stays still. If your happiness depends on being at the top of that wheel, you'll always be afraid because you know it won't last. Boethius listened. Slowly his breathing calmed. He had once taught these very ideas, but in the panic of losing everything, he had forgotten. Philosophy helped him remember. She said, "You thought you were fortunate because you were rich and respected. But those were never really yours. They were only borrowed. Fortune gave them to you, and now she's taken them back. This idea may sound cruel, but to Boethius it began to bring comfort. He realized he'd been clinging to things he couldn't control. His position, his reputation, even the love of the king. But those weren't permanent. What was truly his mind, his reason, his character, was still with him. Philosophy reminded him, the only true good is virtue, the only true evil is vice. Everything else, wealth, pain, pleasure, power, they're just conditions. What matters is how you meet them. Boethius began to see his situation differently. Yes, he was in prison. Yes, he was facing death. But his soul, his reason, his dignities were still free. No one could take that from him. And as he reflected on this, he started to feel something strange. Not anger, not fear. Peace. Boethius began to ask deeper questions. If virtue is the only true good, and if he had tried to live a virtuous life, then why was he suffering? Why did bad things happen to good people? Why did the wicked sometimes prosper while the honest were punished? Philosophy didn't ignore the question. She welcomed it. She explained, what we see as misfortune may not be misfortune at all. Sometimes hardship strengthens the soul, and sometimes prosperity makes people worse. Wealth, pleasure, and power can be dangerous. They distract us from what matters. They tempt us to forget our values. She gave examples, men who'd been powerful only to fall into cruelty, rulers who lost themselves chasing wealth or revenge. She reminded Boethius that real peace doesn't come from what we own, but from how we live. Then she spoke about something even bigger, fate. To many people, fate seems cruel, random, a blind force that crushes the good and lifts the bad. But philosophy explained it differently. She said, fate is not chaos. It's part of a larger order, something we can't fully understand. From where we stand, life looks full of accidents, but imagine looking at it from above, the way a painter sees a full canvas. There's a design, a pattern. Boethius asked, then do we have free will? If fate controls everything, are we just puppets? Philosophy replied, we do have freedom. We can choose how we respond. We can choose to act with wisdom or with foolishness. Fate may set the stage, but we choose our role. These ideas didn't erase Boethius's sorrow, but they helped him carry it differently. He no longer saw himself as a victim of injustice. He saw himself as a man being tested, not by cruel gods, but by life itself. And through that test, he could grow stronger. He wrote poem after poem, reflecting on what he was learning. He wrote about fortune, personified as a woman spinning her wheel, about the stars which move in perfect harmony, even when the earth feels chaotic, about love, which he believed held the whole universe together. In one passage he wrote, if you want to know what governs the world, look not at wealth or armies, but at love. Love is the force that holds all things in place, the stars in the sky, the seasons in order, the hearts of people bound to one another. In the cold silence of his cell, Boethius was building something lasting, a vision of life that didn't depend on wealth, power, or even survival. He was shaping a philosophy that could hold steady through suffering. And though he didn't know it, people would read those words for centuries to come. As the days passed, Boethius's cell didn't change, The walls stayed cold, the future stayed uncertain. But something inside him was different. He no longer paced the floor with anger. He no longer replayed the accusations or imagined revenge. Instead, he wrote. He thought. He found stillness. He had begun his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, full of grief and disbelief. But now, nearing the end, his voice had changed. There was clarity, acceptance, even a quiet joy. He had been stripped of everything, status, freedom, even comfort. But in that emptiness, he had discovered something deeper. Not just survival, but meaning. Philosophy had guided him back to the beliefs he once held, that wisdom, virtue, and love are more lasting than gold or fame, that the mind, though unseen, is our greatest power, and that the soul, though tested, can remain whole even when the body is in chains. In one section, he reflects on the nature of true happiness. He writes that people often chase after wealth, thinking it will make them secure, or fame, thinking it will make them loved, or power, thinking it will protect them. But all these things are fragile. They can disappear overnight. They depend on things outside of us. True happiness, he says, doesn't depend on fortune. It comes from within, from being good and doing good, from living in harmony with reason, from remembering who we really are, and who are we. According to Boethius, we are not just flesh and bone. We are souls, made to seek wisdom, made to seek truth. And in seeking those things, we come closer to the divine. He believed that reason, the ability to think, to question, to reflect, is a gift, a spark of something eternal, and through it we can endure anything, even death. Boethius would never leave that prison, not alive at least. Sometime in the year 524 or early 525 AD, he was executed. Some say he was tortured first, others say it was quick. No records remain to say for sure. His body was buried quietly. The world moved on, but his words remained. The Consolation of Philosophy was copied, shared and treasured for more than 1,000 years. It became one of the most read books in medieval Europe, second only to the Bible. Kings read it. Monks copied it by candlelight. Philosophers quoted it. Poets found inspiration in its verses. Even centuries later, when the language had changed and the empire was gone, Boethius's quiet thoughts lived on. A voice from a prison cell reminding people that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from how you think. That no suffering can take away the peace you carry inside. He didn't escape his fate. He didn't rise again in power. But he left behind something stronger than a throne, a philosophy built on patience, clarity, and truth. So tonight, as you lie back and let your thoughts drift, think of Boethius, not as a prisoner, but as a man who found his mind again when everything else was gone, who met fear with reason, who faced death not with bitterness but with peace. And remember, the world outside may rise and fall, but the world within, your thoughts, your character, your calm, can still be yours. Next is the story of a forgotten philosopher, a woman who taught the skies and numbers in ancient Alexandria, and whose mind shone long after the torches faded. In the ancient city of Alexandria, where the sea met stone and the wind carried the voices of many cultures, a girl was born around 360 AD. Her name was Hypatia. She came into a world that still echoed with the footsteps of great minds. Plato, Ptolemy, Archimedes, and in Alexandria, learning was more than tradition. It was a way of life. The library may have begun to fade, but the thirst for knowledge still filled the city like the scent of ink and oil lamps drifting through marble corridors. Her father, Theon, was a mathematician and philosopher. He believed in the order of the stars and the poetry of numbers, but more than anything he believed in Hypatia. Unlike many parents of the time, He didn't prepare her to be a wife or to keep a house. He prepared her to think. From a young age, Hypatia was surrounded by scrolls and instruments. She studied arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and the teachings of Plato. Her days were filled with learning, tracing stars, solving equations, and listening to her father explain how the heavens moved. She also trained her body, rowing on the Nile and walking long distances, believing that a strong mind needed a strong body. By the time she was a young woman, she'd become something rare, a scholar in a world where women were expected to stay silent. She dressed simply in the robes of a philosopher. Her hair was unadorned, her manner calm. But when she spoke, people listened. Her voice was quiet, but each word landed with purpose. Her presence was magnetic, not because she demanded attention, but because she never seemed to want it. People gathered to hear her speak, under shaded colonnades, in stone lecture halls, or even on the steps of the city's temples. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. But she didn't just recite knowledge. She asked questions, and taught others to do the same. Her students came from all over, from different faiths, different lands. She welcomed them all. To Hypatia, truth had no borders, and wisdom didn't belong to one kind of person. In those early years, her life was calm, built on study, teaching, and quiet influence. She became known across Alexandria as a symbol of the old wisdom, the kind that guided rather than ruled. But even then, in the warm light of her classroom, shadows were starting to form. Alexandria was once a city built on knowledge, where temples, scrolls, and stars all held meaning. But by the early 400s AD, something was changing. The Roman Empire had embraced Christianity, and the new faith was spreading quickly. Some temples were being closed, old statues were torn down, the lines between politics, belief, and fear were becoming harder to see. But Hypatia stayed. She had no temple, no pulpit, no weapons. She had her voice, her scrolls, and her students. She didn't speak for or against any god. She spoke only for reason, for the quiet order behind the universe that she believed anyone could find if they were willing to think. Still, in times of tension, silence can sound like opposition. One of the most powerful men in the city, the Roman governor Orestes, respected Hypatia. He often came to her for advice and listened to her calm, thoughtful counsel. Orestes was a Christian, but moderate. He wanted peace, and so did Hypatia. But peace has enemies. Another man, Bishop Cyril, had also risen to power. He was sharp, charismatic, and determined to make Alexandria a fully Christian city. To him, anything that stood outside the church was a threat, especially ideas, especially someone like Hypatia. She did not shout. She did not resist. She taught. But her calm, her logic, her independence, these were dangerous things in a world driven by fear. And then the rumours began. Some said she used dark magic. Some claimed she was preventing reconciliation between Cyril and Orestes. Others whispered that her knowledge came not from study, but from spirits. The more respected she became, the more dangerous she appeared. Not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. A woman who needed no protection and a mind that could not be controlled. Even as the city grew restless, Hypatia did not change her ways. She still rode through the streets in her chariot, still opened her lectures to all, still spoke of harmony, virtue, and truth. But Alexandria was no longer the city it had been, and her quiet courage was about to be tested in ways no scroll could prepare her for. It was the year 415 AD, and Alexandria no longer felt like the city Hypatia had grown up in. The streets were louder, arguments sparked more easily, walls were covered in slogans. Even the air, once filled with ideas and discussion, now carried the weight of something unspoken. a tension that never quite lifted, but still she remained. Hypatia continued to teach, her calm voice cutting through the noise like a thread of light. Her home became a place of quiet in a city growing restless. People still gathered to learn from her. Christians, pagans, even skeptics. She welcomed them all, as she always had. But the city was shifting beneath her feet. Governor Orestes still visited, still asked for her counsel. He trusted her clarity, her way of seeing through chaos to something more stable underneath. He was trying to hold the peace between factions, between the church and the civil rule, but each week it grew harder. Bishop Cyril, powerful and calculating, had gathered many followers. His vision of Alexandria left little room for those who stood outside the church. Hypatia's open mind, her independence, her influence, all made her dangerous in the eyes of those who feared difference. Rumours began to spread, that she was a sorceress, that she controlled Orestes, that she was trying to stop God's will. None of it was true. She had never taken sides. Her only allegiance was to reason, to harmony, to the quiet order of the stars. But reason is often the first thing pushed aside when fear takes hold. Even her daily routines began to feel different. Her chariot rides through the city, once peaceful, now drew stares. Some of them admiring, others full of suspicion. People whispered in corners when she passed. A few turned their backs. At night she would sit by the light of an oil lamp, scrolls on her table, the hum of the city distant and uneasy. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. But she understood what happens when truth becomes inconvenient, and when power no longer values peace. Still, she did not stop teaching. She did not run. She did not hide. She believed, as she always had, that the mind was the one thing that could not be broken, unless we let it be. And so, even as the storm gathered, Hypatia stood where she always had, in the middle, calm, unshaken, certain that even in dark times a clear voice mattered. To understand why Hypatia mattered so deeply, you have to look beyond the drama of Alexandria and into the quiet work she did every day. She was not just a teacher. She was one of the last great scholars of the ancient world. Her field was broad: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. She read Plato and Aristotle, but didn't just repeat their words. She explained them, clarified them, and made them easier to grasp. She edited and preserved older texts, protecting knowledge that might have otherwise been lost in the fires of history. She worked on conic sections, curves formed by slicing a cone at different angles, circles, ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas. These shapes, simple at a glance, are still at the heart of science and engineering today. Parabolas guide satellite dishes. Ellipses describe the orbits of planets. And Hypatia taught them with nothing but sand, wax, and a brilliant mind. Brilliant. She also helped develop astronomical charts. She built and improved instruments, like the astrolabe, a device used to measure the position of stars and planets, useful for both navigation and understanding the heavens. She may have also worked on the hydrometer, used to measure the density of liquids, something still used in laboratories today. She wrote commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, a foundational text in algebra. Her explanations helped others understand equations and number theory in a time when few had the skills or patience to decode the complexity of Greek mathematics. But perhaps her greatest talent was not in solving problems, it was in helping others think. Her classroom wasn't a room at all, not always. Sometimes she taught in open courtyards, sometimes in her home, sometimes while walking through the city. Her students came from many walks of life: philosophers, politicians, even priests. They didn't just learn equations, they learned how to reason, how to argue without hatred, how to question with grace. One of her students, Synesius, later became a bishop, and even after converting to Christianity, he kept writing to Hypatia for advice. In his letters you can hear it: deep admiration, quiet awe, and a constant turning to her when he needed clarity. Hypatia didn't publish books of her own theories, but she passed on the tools that allowed others to build their own. Her role was like a bridge, connecting the wisdom of the ancient world to a future that was quickly changing. And in that role, she stood almost alone. In a time when few women were taught to read, she was leading the most advanced lessons of her day. In a time when politics ruled thought, she taught that truth belonged to no empire. In a time when certainty was prized, she honoured doubt, the kind that seeks, not the kind that destroys. This was her real legacy. Not power, not fame, but clarity. She had no army, no throne, and yet her ideas travelled, carried in the minds of those who had once sat beside her and watched her draw circles in the dust. She reminded them, and reminds us still, that the universe, even in its wildness, holds patterns, that thought can be gentle, and that reason, quiet as it may seem, is a force the world can't always contain. March of 415 D. The sun rose over Alexandria as it always did, soft and golden, cutting between the domes and pillars. But something in the air had changed, a quiet unease that couldn't quite be named. That morning, Hypatia left her home as she had done many times before. She rode in her chariot, moving slowly through the streets. The wind tugged at her cloak. People watched from doorways. Some nodded, some turned away. She was no stranger to attention. But this felt different. A group was waiting. A crowd. Not her students. Not the curious. These were men stirred by fear, pride, and power. Fueled by rumours and led by rage. They were part of the Parabolani, a brotherhood meant to care for the sick, but now known more for their loyalty to Bishop Cyril and their willingness to act without question. They surrounded her. She didn't run. Maybe she didn't believe it was truly happening. Maybe she did. The details that follow are hard to speak, even centuries later. They dragged her from her chariot into the streets, into a church, into the hands of men who believed they were doing something holy. What they did was brutal. No one came to stop them. There was no trial, no defence, no voice loud enough to break through the moment. And just like that, Alexandria lost one of its brightest lights. When news spread, it didn't roar, it whispered. People lowered their eyes, some mourned, some stayed silent, some pretended not to know. Governor Orestes, her friend and student, vanished from the record soon after. Bishop Cyril grew even more powerful, and Alexandria, once a city of scrolls and stars, began to forget what it had lost. But not entirely, because Hypatia's story didn't end in that church. It slipped past the walls. It travelled. Students carried her name east and west. Centuries passed, and when Europe began to wake from its long sleep of forgetting, people spoke of her again as a symbol, a martyr, a warning. Later writers imagined her walking calmly into the light. They made statues of her, eyes lifted, hand resting on a globe, scrolls at her feet. They called her the last scholar of the ancient world. But her real legacy isn't carved in stone. It's in the quiet courage to think clearly when others shout, to teach when the world wants obedience, to choose truth even when it doesn't keep you safe. She once said, or was remembered to have said, reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. And so, the story of Hypatia of Alexandria ends not in silence but in echo. Next, we drift from the libraries of Alexandria to the windblown cities of the Islamic Golden Age, where knowledge was not just preserved, but reawakened. Our next forgotten story is about Al-Farabi, a man they once called the second teacher, right after Aristotle. But most people today don't know his name. Let's change that. It's around the year 870. Somewhere near the borders of modern-day Kazakhstan or northern Afghanistan, a child is born into a culture rich with language, tradition, and shifting empires. His real name is Abu Nasr Muhammad Al-Farabi. but most just remember him by his last name, Farabi, and the mark he left on the world. Little is known about his early childhood. The records are quiet, sparse. But we know he grew up in a world where Arabic was the language of science and scholarship, where Persian poetry floated through the air, and where Greek philosophy, newly translated into Arabic, had found a second life in the hands of scholars across Baghdad, Damascus and beyond. Farabi would have been surrounded by trade routes and tales, by travellers and teachers. The Silk Road passed nearby, a highway not just for silk and spices but for ideas, and Farabi was drawn to those ideas early. He studied first in the eastern cities, perhaps in Farab, perhaps in Merv. But it was when he reached Baghdad, the heart of intellectual life in the Islamic world, that everything began to change. Baghdad at this time was a city of learning. It had observatories, libraries, academies. The famous House of Wisdom, by Al-Hikmah, was a place where texts were translated, debated and shared across cultures. Greek texts, Indian mathematics, Persian medicine, all filtered through curious minds. And into this world stepped Farabi. He was quiet, serious. He spoke several languages, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and probably Turkish. And he wasn't just interested in one subject. He studied logic, music, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, metaphysics. He read Aristotle so deeply, so faithfully, that later scholars began calling him the second teacher, the first being Aristotle himself. But Farabi wasn't just copying Aristotle. He was trying to bridge ancient ideas with the world he lived in, a world of empires, caliphs, laws and faith. He asked, how should a society be ruled? What is the best life a person can live? Can reason and religion exist in harmony? These questions guided his journey. But before he could answer them, he had to understand everything, from the movement of the stars to the patterns of the human soul. At night, it said, he would study alone under dim lamps in the corners of libraries, wearing plain clothes, living simply. Some stories say he worked as a gardener, tending flowers by day and reading by candlelight at night. He didn't chase riches or titles. He chased truth and believed it belonged to those willing to sit with it in silence. Al-Farabi was deep in study, a quiet figure in the shadows of Baghdad's libraries, absorbing every idea he could find. But he wasn't gathering knowledge just for its own sake. He was preparing to build something larger, a philosophy that could guide entire societies. And for that, he turned to a single question. What is the ideal city, and how should people live in it? Farabi believed that just as the body needs health, a society needs virtue. He imagined a city not built of stone, but of harmony, where each person played their part, not for personal gain, but for the good of all. He wrote a book called The Virtuous City. In it, he blended ideas from Plato's Republic with the teachings of Islam, the logic of Aristotle, and his own deep understanding of human nature. The virtuous city, he said, was like a well-ordered body. Each part, the rulers, the scholars, the merchants, the workers, had its role. And at the top was the wise ruler, someone who guided not by force but by reason, a philosopher king, a person of deep understanding and moral clarity. Farabi wasn't naive. He knew that real cities were full of ambition, conflict and pride. But he believed that with education, with the right leader, and with shared values, a society could come close to virtue. He also described the opposite. Cities that had lost their way. Cities of ignorance. Cities of greed. Cities ruled by desires rather than reason. And he warned that most cities in the world lean this way. But still, he held on to hope. He believed that truth, once found, could guide people back. Farabi also believed deeply in the power of reason. He saw no contradiction between faith and intellect. In fact, he argued that true religion and true philosophy were both paths to the same truth, just spoken in different languages. One reached the heart, the other reached the mind. This was a bold idea. At a time when debates over religion and politics could be dangerous, Farabi suggested that wisdom should lead both, that the best ruler was not a warrior or a wealthy man, but someone who understood the nature of the soul, the purpose of life, and the meaning of justice. He didn't just write for scholars, he wrote for leaders, for thinkers, for anyone who wanted to understand the deeper patterns of the world and how to live well inside it. Farabi also loved music. He wrote about its mathematical structure, its emotional power, and its role in healing. He believed that music, like reason, could bring harmony, not just to the body, but to the soul. He saw the universe as something deeply ordered, like a great piece of music, each part resonating with the rest, each thing having its tone, its pattern, its place. And when people lived in harmony with that order, with truth, with virtue, they found peace. In this way, Farabi wasn't just a philosopher. He was a quiet architect of wisdom, someone trying to sketch a better world, not in buildings or borders, but in thoughts. He moved often during his life, from Baghdad to Aleppo, then to Damascus, always studying, always writing. He never sought fame, and he died as quietly as he lived. But his words would echo for centuries. Farabi saw the soul not as something fixed, but as something that could grow, shaped by learning, reflection, and discipline. To him, each person had the potential to rise from the level of instinct and desire, to the clarity of thought, and finally, to wisdom. He described a kind of ladder, a path the soul could take toward perfection. At the lowest level were those ruled by emotion or appetite, chasing pleasure or reacting in anger. A bit higher were those moved by imagination, drawn to symbols and stories. Then came reason, the ability to understand, to judge, to ask why. And beyond reason, something even finer, intuition, the moment when truth becomes clear not through effort, but through quiet recognition. To Farabi, the highest human goal was not simply knowledge, it was becoming wise, living in alignment with the deeper order of the universe, doing what is right not because of reward or fear, but because the soul sees that it is good. He believed that such souls could come close to the divine, not by miracles or visions, but by clarity of thought and a calm life devoted to truth. This idea shaped his vision of leadership as well. A real ruler, he wrote, must be someone who has walked this inner path, someone who rules not with ambition, but with understanding, like a doctor who treats a patient not out of pride, but because he knows what health is. Farabi also believed that the world we see, the physical world, is just a shadow of something deeper. He wasn't against the material, but he saw it as a reflection of a greater reality. Just as a candle's flame points to fire, our thoughts, if shaped by reason, can point to something eternal. He often used light as a symbol. Just as the sun lights the world, the mind, when properly trained, brings light to the soul. Confusion, anger, and fear, he saw them as shadows, and through study, patience, and discipline, the shadows could fade. This wasn't just theory for Farabi, it was a way of life. He lived simply, wrote constantly. He avoided court politics, though many rulers respected him. It's said that when he came to visit Prince Saif al-Dawla in Aleppo, he wore simple clothes and sat at the end of the hall unnoticed among the scholars. When asked to speak, he did so clearly, calmly, and with such depth that everyone turned to listen. People described him as gentle and self-contained, not cold, but inward, someone whose peace came not from the world, but from the order within him, and yet his ideas weren't withdrawn from life. They offered a guide, for rulers, for teachers, for ordinary people, a way to understand the self, the world, and the mystery that holds it all together. He believed that by tuning the soul, like tuning an instrument, we could bring our lives into harmony with the universe, and in doing so, we could find joy, not the sharp joy of excitement, but the quiet joy of understanding. In his view, the soul that has seen the truth becomes like a calm lake. Nothing stirs it easily. Praise doesn't swell it. Blame doesn't shake it. It reflects what is, and it acts with care. And such souls, he thought, are the true lights of the world. Farabi wasn't just a philosopher. He was also a musician, one of the finest of his time. He believed that music wasn't simply for entertainment. It was a science, a language, a mirror of the cosmos. In his famous book, The Great Book of Music, he explored how sound worked, how notes combined, how rhythm flowed, how melody could stir the heart. But more than that, he tried to show that music followed patterns just like mathematics, and those patterns, he believed, reflected the deeper order of the universe. To Farabi, music was more than art. It was proof that beauty and logic could coexist. He saw how a simple string, when divided by the right ratios, produced notes that sounded pleasing. He studied how different scales could create different moods: joy, sadness, calm, longing. He believed that these effects weren't random. They revealed something about the human soul. He also believed that music could be used as a form of healing. In the right setting, with the right sounds, it could bring balance to a troubled mind. It could quiet anxiety, ease sorrow, or awaken clarity. Just as medicine works on the body, music, he believed, could work on the spirit. Some legends say that Farabi could play the oud so beautifully he could make people weep or fall asleep. That when he performed in a crowded hall, his music was so precise and gentle that it settled even the most restless hearts. But Farabi didn't think of music as magic. For him, it was knowledge, something that could be studied, understood, and used wisely. This belief in harmony ran through all of his work. In politics, he wanted rulers to be like conductors, not controlling people with force, but guiding them into harmony with one another. A city, he thought, could be like a well-played song. Every part, every person has a place. And when each part plays its role rightly, the whole becomes beautiful. In ethics too, he saw balance as the key. Not too much of one thing, not too little of another. Just like in music, where a single off note can spoil the whole melody, a single excess, in anger, in pride, in desire, could throw the soul out of tune. This idea wasn't new. It echoed ancient thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato. But Farabi brought it into the Islamic world with a clarity and gentleness that made it his own. And it shaped how later scholars, and musicians, rulers and poets would see the world. For Farabi, philosophy was never dry. It wasn't a set of rules or dusty arguments. It was a search, a journey toward understanding, a quiet unfolding of truth, like a melody rising slowly through silence. And in every question, whether about politics, music, or the stars, he was asking the same thing. How can we live in harmony? How can the soul become still? How can thought and feeling, body and spirit, world and wisdom become one? These weren't questions with quick answers, but to Farabi, even asking them patiently, honestly, was already a step toward peace. Al-Farabi was no longer young. His beard had turned grey, his body slower, but his mind still burned quietly with the same steady flame it always had. He never sought fame, yet kings and scholars alike now spoke his name with reverence. They called him the second teacher, placing him only after Aristotle, the great first. Still, he remained humble. He didn't write to be admired. He wrote to understand, and to help others do the same. In his final years, Farabi travelled to Damascus. By now, he had walked across most of the Islamic world, from his birthplace near the steppes of Central Asia to the libraries of Baghdad, to the courts of Aleppo and beyond. He'd studied every form of knowledge he could find: music, logic, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, law, even the shape of the soul. But now, as he aged, he returned to the quieter questions: how to live, how to think, how to be in harmony with the world and with oneself. They say he lived simply, wearing plain clothes, walking barefoot, never demanding riches from the powerful men who admired him. In Aleppo, the ruler Saif al-Dawla offered him great honours, but Farabi reportedly declined any luxury. He preferred silence over spectacle, a garden over a throne, a scroll over a banquet. And yet, his influence was vast. He didn't just explain the Greeks, he reimagined them. He showed how reason and faith could live in the same room, not as enemies, but as partners in seeking truth. To Farabi, the world was not divided into opposites. It was layered: body and soul, sound and silence, city and solitude. A philosopher didn't need to choose one over the other. A philosopher could walk the middle path, listening carefully, thinking clearly, and living justly. He believed the highest form of happiness wasn't wealth or pleasure. It was intellectual perfection, a kind of inner clarity, a peace that comes from knowing and acting in harmony with what you know. He described it as a union between the rational soul and the active intellect, a mysterious concept passed down from Aristotle, meaning something like the eternal spark behind all understanding. He didn't claim to have touched that union, but he tried to show others the way. He also left behind something rare, a sense of balance. Farabi didn't shout, he didn't condemn, he didn't demand the world change for him. Instead, he studied it and tried to understand how it could work better, with gentleness, with logic, and with music. Even in his book about the ideal state, he described a ruler not as a warrior or a king, but as a philosopher, someone with wisdom, restraint, and care. He dreamed of a world led not by hunger for power, but by hunger for truth. His final days were quiet. There are few records of how or where he died. Some say he passed away in Damascus around the year 950. Others say he was buried under the stars in a simple grave with no grand ceremony. But what he left behind was anything but small. His works were studied for centuries. His ideas shaped thinkers across the Islamic world, like Avicenna, Averroes, and even those in medieval Europe. Without him, much of Plato and Aristotle might have been lost to the West entirely. He became a bridge between East and West, between philosophy and faith, between past and future. And maybe that's the quiet brilliance of Al-Farabi. He didn't try to dominate history. He tried to serve it, to carry forward the light of thought across borders and empires, through dust and time. Now we drift to another quiet mind. John Philoponus, a thinker who dared to question the stars themselves. The stars over Alexandria are still. The sea is quiet, and in the flickering glow of a single oil lamp, a man leans over parchment, thinking thoughts most men would not dare speak aloud. His name is John, but history remembers him as Philoponus, meaning lover of work, a name he earned honestly, for few minds in his time worked harder or dared more. It's the 6th century. The old Roman world has splintered. The Western Empire is gone. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, is holding on, just barely. But in Alexandria the libraries are still filled with scrolls, and the memory of ancient thinkers lingers in the marble halls. Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, their shadows still stretch long. And yet, one man is beginning to question those shadows. Philoponus was likely born in Alexandria around the year 490. He was Christian, at a time when that was both common and controversial, depending on which kind. He was educated in Greek philosophy, in the old way, the teachings of Aristotle, the logic of syllogisms, the order of the cosmos. But he wasn't content to memorize. He questioned, he argued. He pointed out what didn't make sense, even when it came from Aristotle himself. This was radical. Aristotle, to most scholars, was nearly untouchable. His words were treated almost like scripture, not to be edited, not to be doubted. But John Philoponus saw cracks, and he began to press. One of his earliest critiques was on motion. Aristotle had said, "A thing keeps moving only because something keeps pushing it. Stop pushing, and it stops. That's why an arrow flies through the air, is because the air behind it keeps it moving." Philoponus disagreed. He proposed something bold, that a body, once in motion, keeps moving, not because the air pushes it, but because something was given to it at the start. A kind of impetus, a force inside the object itself. This might seem small, but it was a crack in a wall that had stood for 900 years, and through that crack, new ideas would later flood in, ideas that would eventually shape the work of Galileo and Newton. But Philoponus didn't stop there. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle's physics, on the heavens and meteorology. But instead of repeating Aristotle's words, he challenged them, carefully, thoughtfully, and always with the tools of logic and reason. He asked, why do we assume the heavens are made of a special unchanging substance? Why should the stars move in perfect circles? Why is there any separation at all between the laws of heaven and the laws on earth? To John, the cosmos wasn't divided. It was a single, created whole, governed not by different rules in different regions, but by unity, logic, and design. He wasn't just arguing physics. He was doing something more dangerous. He was blending faith with science, and in doing so, he made friends and enemies. He spoke of a universe with a beginning, not eternal, as Aristotle believed. He used philosophy to defend Christian ideas, not just through scripture, but through natural reason. To some, this made him a genius. To others, it made him a threat. Still, he kept working. He studied light, questioning Aristotle's idea that light was not a substance but an instantaneous change. Philoponus suggested instead that light might be something real, with speed and substance. Again, an idea centuries ahead of its time. He wrote about time, matter, logic, and even theology. He debated with the best minds of his day, often leaving them silent or enraged, because John Philoponus had a mind that would not be quiet. And even when he stood alone, he kept asking questions. By the time he was in his 40s, his writings had begun to draw serious attention. Some admired his clarity. Some condemned him as a heretic. And some simply didn't know what to do with him. He was too Christian for the pagans, too questioning for the orthodox, too logical for the mystics, and too bold for those who wanted peace more than truth. But John didn't write for comfort. He wrote for clarity. And though his world was still ruled by the weight of ancient thought, he saw, faintly, bravely, the first glimmer of something new, a world where truth was not simply inherited, but tested, where faith and reason could walk together as not in silence, but in dialogue, where the stars above obeyed the same laws as the stones beneath our feet, and so, he wrote by lamplight, a scholar, a rebel, a man whose questions would echo long after his name was forgotten. As John's work began to spread, the city around him was shifting. Alexandria had long been a place where ideas clashed. Religion, science, philosophy, politics, all pressing against each other like tectonic plates. The great library was gone now, burned in pieces across generations. But the echoes remained, and in those echoes Philoponus kept writing. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't lead a school. He didn't have powerful patrons behind him. Just parchment, a pen, and a restless mind. His critiques of Aristotle were now more than whispers. In his commentary on the Heavens, he argued that the idea of eternal motion, the stars circling forever, without beginning or end, didn't make sense. Aristotle had claimed the universe had no beginning. John disagreed. He said the cosmos had been created in time, that it wasn't eternal, but born. He gave reasons. He argued that if the universe had no beginning, then an infinite number of events had already happened, and if so, how could anything ever arrive at now? He asked, how can infinity be completed? It was a daring move, using philosophical tools to argue for creation. This caught the attention of theologians. Some admired his clever reasoning, others saw danger in blending science with sacred truths. But John was careful. He wasn't trying to prove religion through force. He was trying to show that faith and reason weren't enemies. And in the process, he did something no one expected. He brought new life into old philosophy. In one of his more famous moments, Philoponus attacked the idea of a fifth element, the so-called ether, said to make up the heavens. Aristotle taught that all earthly matter was made of four elements: earth, water, air, fire. But the stars, the planets, the sky, these, he said, were made of a special perfect substance that never changed. Philoponus said, no. He saw no reason to believe the heavens were made of anything different. They moved. They had parts. They were not beyond analysis. To the readers of his time, this was almost scandalous. You don't challenge Aristotle like that. But John wasn't doing it for fame. He saw it as necessary, like cleaning the windows to let in more light. And the light he let in would eventually reach centuries ahead. In fact, nearly 1,000 years later, his writings would be rediscovered and read by Galileo, who would later echo Philoponus's thoughts in his own challenges to tradition. But in his own time, John's voice was often a lonely one. He didn't have a movement. He didn't start a school or lead a revolt. He just kept writing, correcting, questioning. And still, he kept his faith. He wrote theological works, arguing for the unity of Christ's nature in ways that would later cause controversy. This would eventually lead to condemnation by the church. His works were banned in some places, and his name, slowly, was pushed into silence. But before that silence fell, he left behind something powerful, a model of thought that didn't flinch. He believed that truth could stand examination, that even sacred texts deserved to be understood, not blindly repeated, that even ancient wisdom could be mistaken, and that pointing it out was not disrespect but a kind of devotion. To seek what is true, even when it's unpopular, that was Philoponus's creed. He never shouted, he didn't burn or tear down, he asked questions, he used reason, and in doing so he kept the flame of inquiry burning, even when others tried to snuff it out. As the years passed, John's writings grew bolder. He had already questioned the heavens. Now he turned to earth. Specifically, motion. At the time, people believed that a moving object required a continuous force to keep it going. If you throw a rock, it moves only because your hand pushed it, and when the force runs out, it stops. This was Aristotle's view, and it dominated for centuries. But John saw something different. He argued that when something is thrown, it carries with it an internal motive force, what he called an impetus. This force continues to act on the object even after the initial push. Only when resistance, like air or friction, slows it down does it stop. To modern ears, this might sound familiar, because it is. The idea of impetus would later inspire early versions of inertia, the foundation of Newton's first law of motion. But this was the 6th century. John had no lab, no experiments, just a mind watching the world carefully and daring to think differently. He asked, if you drop two weights of different size, which one hits the ground first? Aristotle said the heavier one. John said, no, they'll fall together, because weight doesn't determine speed in that way. 1,000 years later, Galileo would perform the same thought, and even climb a tower to test it. But John had already written it down, quietly, clearly and forgotten. For a time it seemed none of it would survive. His theology made him a target. His science made him suspicious. Church councils condemned his religious writings, and many of his books were lost. But not all. His scientific commentaries, written in Greek, passed slowly through the hands of translators, copied, hidden, reappearing in Arabic centuries later. In the great centres of Islamic science, his name became known again. And from there, his ideas crept back into Europe, reshaping thought without always being recognised. Philoponus was like a stone dropped in deep water. The splash was small, but the ripples travelled far. Back in Alexandria, though, his life was quieter now. No position, no crowd of students, just scrolls and silence. But his mind never slowed. He continued to ask how the universe worked, not only as a machine, but as a creation. To him, philosophy and theology were not at war. They were branches of the same tree, both reaching for understanding, both rooted in truth. And he believed that even flawed thinkers of the past were stepping stones. You didn't honour them by repeating them. You honoured them by questioning, by continuing the journey they began. Among all his ideas there was one that stood out, one that would echo for centuries. John believed the universe had a beginning. To us, that might sound obvious. But in his time, it was radical. The dominant belief, going back to Aristotle, was that the universe had always existed. No start, no end, just eternal motion in circles. The stars spinning, the heavens fixed, and time without origin. But Philoponus said no. He argued that the universe was created. That time itself had a starting point. And he didn't just say this as a matter of faith. He gave reasons. He used logic. He said, if the universe had no beginning, then an infinite number of events would have already happened. But an actual infinity can't exist in reality. You can't cross an infinite past to reach the present. Therefore, time must have started. This was called the kalam-cosmological argument, a phrase that would come centuries later. But the core idea came from him. At the time, these thoughts were dismissed. Too speculative, too bold. But hundreds of years later, Muslim philosophers picked up his ideas. They debated them, refined them, and passed them on. And in the 20th century, when science began to suggest that the universe did indeed have a beginning, with the Big Bang, with space and time emerging from a single point, Philoponus's old arguments quietly returned. His voice, once faint, had travelled far, but he never lived to see that. In his final years, John Philoponus remained largely unknown outside a circle of thinkers. He didn't found a school, he wasn't declared a saint, he didn't leave behind great buildings or monuments. What he left was harder to see, a thread of reason woven through time, a willingness to ask, what if Aristotle was wrong? A courage to say, let's start over, and think again. John Philoponus died sometime around the year 570 AD. There were no crowds at his funeral, no fanfare, no grand recognition. For centuries after, his name was barely mentioned. His books were copied quietly, passed hand to hand among scholars who saw something different in them. Not just boldness, but clarity. Not just faith, but reason. Much of what he wrote was preserved by Muslim thinkers. Centuries later, his works reappeared in Latin translations. They sparked debates in medieval Europe. They helped nudge open the door to a new kind of thinking, where observation and logic challenged old authority. His idea that light travels with a finite speed, that space is not eternal, that motion needs no external mover once started. These thoughts would wait patiently in silence, like seeds, until the world was ready. Even today, most people don't know his name, but his questions helped shape the way we ask our own. He showed that doubt can be respectful, that even the greatest minds before us can be questioned, not with arrogance, but with curiosity. That truth isn't threatened by new thoughts, it's discovered through them. So tonight, as you rest, let your thoughts drift to a quiet desk in Alexandria, where a man named John once asked what no one dared to, and maybe, in your own life, when something seems too certain, too fixed, too settled, you'll remember him, and ask, what if there's another way to think about this?